Welcome to Author Talk on CBSNews.com. I'm Jeff Glor, joined today by Michael Cannell, author of The Limit, which tells the story of the 1961 Grand Prix Circuit, which was a fascinating, terrifying, exhilarating racing season. First of all, The Limit is what?
The limit is a concept that the drivers themselves talked about constantly. They were obsessed with this idea that there was a physical boundary that they could go to but should not go over. In other words, if on any given track, in any given car, on any given day, there was a theoretical maximum speed, and if they went over that, they would crash. And they were obsessed with this idea of getting as close to the limit as possible. Not just for one lap, but for many, many laps.
And so typically they went about 8/10 of the limit. Sometimes they pushed 9/10, and then sometimes obviously hit the limit.
Well, they were trying to go 10/10 of the limit. The question was, how long could they sustain that for? The atmosphere of the rivalries being what they were, they often knowingly went over the limit, and often with tragic result.
We talk about how dangerous racing can be at times today, but also how much safer it has gotten. It was incredibly dangerous 50 years ago, what we're talking about. The survival rate, you said by one estimate, was 33% only?
It was unbelievably dangerous. And even now, I still can't get my head around the mortality rate. Over the course of the career of the two drivers that we follow in this book, about 100 drivers died. Phil Hill, who is an American driver and the first to break into the Ferrari team, when he joined the team, he was surrounded at dinner by his teammates, and just about all of those teammates died over the course of his time with Ferrari.
When these guys got into it, they were almost assuming they were going to die at some point.
There was
back in this day.
You know, from the perspective of our culture, it seems the tolerance for bloodshed seems almost unthinkable. There was a strange acceptance of the bloodshed and death, and in some of that, I think, had to do with World War II, which was, of course, a recent memory when these drivers were driving. But I think there was something more fundamental to that. For the Europeans who had put young men into the most sophisticated machinery they could come up with and thrown them at one another for centuries, there was something very deep-seated and meaningful for them about sending these young men out to their deaths and then having beautiful funerals.
You mentioned Phil Hill. He's the hero of your book, an American sports hero that not a lot of people know of, actually. This is a kid who grew up in California. He loved cars.
Yeah, I like to think of Phil Hill as the greatest American champion that Americans have never heard of. He grew up in Santa Monica, and he was driven to mechanics by really his parents' alcoholism. His parents were terrible alcoholics and abusive characters. And Phil Hill escaped to a world in which every action had a predictable reaction. And I think for him, that was what he liked initially about mechanics. It was reassuring that these cars would behave in a predictable way.
An introspective character, Phil?
Introspective. Of course, when he raced in Europe, he was surrounded by these impossibly flamboyant characters, these rich Europeans from great aristocratic families, playboys, bon vivants. But he was a loner, and he was a very sensitive man, a musician, and a man with an artistic sensibility. And in between races, he would often just go to his hotel room and listen to classical music.
So how did this guy who grew up in America in a garage, although his parents were relatively well-to-do, we should say, how did this who grew up in this atmosphere, introspective, private, shy, the exact opposite of so many of these racers in the European circuit, how did he succeed there?
Well, he had a great talent for racing, and that talent derived from his talent for mechanics. He was a classical pianist, and he had the same kind of sympathy for the car that he had with the piano. He had an uncanny way of knowing what the car needed, when the car was being pushed too far, when the car could take some more. He really had this almost supernatural ability to predict what the car was capable of.
I think you say somewhere in the book he just basically thought he just always expressed himself via the automobile.
Well, he was so anxious about racing. He was overwrought by the danger and at one point tried to quit racing. He was inevitably drawn back into racing because it was what he was good at. He had a genius for racing, and he was not fulfilled unless he raced.
His nemesis now, the German Wolfgang Von Trips,
Right.
which is just a beautiful name.
It is a beautiful name.
When you're talking
Yeah.
about a nemesis, by
Yeah.
the way. These guys started competing against each other when?
Well, they were both on the Ferrari sports car team by 1957.
So they're technically teammates, but
They were teammates and they were friends, but by 1959, 60, 61, they had become great rivals. Particularly in 1961, when all of Europe, if not the world, was watching to see which of these two men would win the world championship.
and polar opposites personality-wise as well.
Absolute polar opposites in every imaginable way.
So 1961, the circuit begins. Most people thought that the German would win.
Well, that's right. He looked like he would win. He looked like a champion. He had the air of a matinee idol. He carried himself as a natural champion. And what's more, he was really favored by Ferrari. Ferrari discounted the American driver.
It became it became an epic battle, and we talked about the way in which it was terrifying, and also a bittersweet victory for Phil Hill. Not to spoil too much of the
Yeah.
book here, but this is obviously public record at this point. But again, we go back to the death that pervaded the circuit at this time. The final race that won it for Phil Hill. Maybe you can recap that briefly for us.
Well, let me back up just a little bit and say that in 1961, Ferrari came up with a car that was known as the Shark Nose, possibly the most beautiful car ever made. And in the previous years, Ferrari had been losing to the British cars. Mm-hmm. But with the Shark Nose, Ferrari knew they would win. But it was really a question of which Ferrari driver would win, Phil Hill or Wolfgang Von Trips. Now, on most teams, the team managers would have designated the lead driver and asked the other driver to step back. That was not Enzo Ferrari's MO. He really pitted them against each other, and he let them fight it out over an excruciating season, which climaxes in that Italian Grand Prix in September of 1961.
Enzo Ferrari, by the way, another dominant figure in this book, and a domineering personality at that.
Yes.
I mean, he as you said, he pitted them against each other. He drove everyone to the edge because he worked at the edge himself.
He was a very dark Machiavellian character, and he loved these drivers like sons. He also, in a sense, threw them to their deaths, one after another. And when they died, he mourned as if they were his own sons. And then he would build a bigger, faster car and send the drivers back out.
What drove Enzo Ferrari?
Well, that's a very, very difficult question. Very complicated man. Part of it was national pride. You can imagine the sentiment in Italy after World War II. It was a country that was torn apart by the war, and part of it was national pride. He was, along with the Pope, Enzo Ferrari was the great figure in Italy after the war. And when Ferrari won, Italy won.
Even though he didn't often have Italian drivers.
No, I mean it's a kind of a funny aspect of racing then and racing now was that Enzo Ferrari would hire ringers. He was sort of the New York Yankees of the 1950s. He would hire the best drivers that he could.
But also because of the backlash he got in Italy if an Italian driver died.
Well, that was part of it. I don't know that he ever said that explicitly. My own feeling is that he came to hire British drivers and then a series of American drivers, starting with Phil Hill, because if an American driver died, the Italian public didn't quite care as much.
All right, so we won't spoil too many details of this fascinating climax to the race. But let me ask about after it. Phil Hill then, life was not easy. It was somewhat complicated for him after the fact.
Yeah, he came back to America, and he had the exquisitely bad timing of winning the championship right about the time that Roger Maris broke Babe Ruth's home run record. So who was going to be the hero in that scenario?
Right.
Not many Americans. They knew about the Grand Prix. They may have heard of it, but they certainly didn't follow it. So the last race of that season was in Watkins Glen, New York. And that really should have been his grand homecoming. He should have come home a hero to Watkins Glen. But Enzo Ferrari canceled Ferrari's participation in that race, thereby denying Phil Hill the chance to show up as the hero.
But he still stayed involved in the racing game. He just didn't want to get away from it.
He raced Phil Hill. Yeah, he raced for 6 more years, but he never came close to recapturing the form of 1961. It was almost as if the death of his friend and rival Wolfgang Von Trips tore his world apart.
By all accounts, Phil Hill should be, as we mentioned at the top, should be a more famous American hero, one would think, than he is now. Which is why it's interesting that he's getting the attention now through your book and through potentially a movie starring Tobey Maguire.
Well, that's right. There is I did sell the rights to this movie to Columbia Sony, and Tobey Maguire has I don't know if I should say signed up, but he has is interested in playing the part of Phil Hill, which would be, I have to say, I think an amazing movie part. Phil Hill not only is a great champion, but is a complicated and fascinating man.
Wolfgang Von Trips, any actor attached to his role right now?
Well, not yet, but it's fun to speculate as to who that might be.
You're a design guy as well, former editor of the House and Home section of the New York Times.
That's right.
For a number of years. So quickly, before we go, I wanted to ask you, you've clearly seen all these Steve Jobs eulogies. I assume you paid a decent amount of attention to Apple, and much of the talk was about design. Are you an Apple guy?
I was an Apple guy from the very first Mac. I bought that first Mac when it came out, what was that, 1980? 84, something like that.
Was that the 2 or the 2E? Or
no, the first Macintosh.
The Mac was after the 2E. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I have just finished reading Walter Isaacson's extraordinary biography.
What do you think
of Steve Jobs? Well, there has been a tendency in this country for a long time to dismiss design as a topic for sissy boys and housewives. And really, with Steve Jobs, I think we see the way in which design can play a very, very important role in our, not just our built environment, but in our culture. Design represents innovation, and I think Apple is maybe the best possible example of that.
For Jobs, it was the biggest thing, correct?
Yeah, sure. It was about innovation.
And we talked about, speaking of design, Ferraris.
And Ferraris, yeah. I mean, in a sense, Enzo Ferrari was the Steve Jobs of his time. They were both brilliant, very complicated, and difficult characters, and utterly uncompromising.
Even though a Ferrari costs slightly more than an iPad.
That's true.
These days, at least. Fascinating discussion. The book is called The Limit. We thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
You've been watching Author Talk on CBSNews.com.